I am Zuri, 32 years old, and I recently destroyed the people who thought I was nothing. At the estate dinner, my husband leaned in and whispered, "Stay quiet, these people are way above your level." I said nothing and took my seat. Then the host, a billionaire real estate mogul, rushed over, shook my hand, and welcomed me like the most important guest in the room. Seconds later, every elite guest stood up. My husband's face went pale when he realized who they were really there to see. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to put arrogant family members in their place. The night it all came crashing down started at the entrance of the Obsidian, the most exclusive private estate in Atlanta. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of old money. Valets in crisp white jackets were taking the keys to luxury vehicles, bowing to the city's elite. My husband Marcus handed over the keys to his leased Mercedes, with a nervous sweat already forming on his forehead. Marcus was a mid-level bank manager who spent every waking moment trying to convince the world he was a titan of industry. He obsessed over his image, desperate to project a level of black excellence that he simply could not afford. And he spent just as much time trying to make me feel small. Before we even reached the grand double doors of the estate, Marcus grabbed my arm. His grip was tight and frantic as he pulled me aside into the shadows of the marble columns. "Change this dress right now," he hissed through his teeth, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "I told you to wear something that does not look so cheap." Preston just texted me that his wife Chloe is wearing an authentic designer gown. "You are going to humiliate me in front of the investors with this off-the-rack garbage." I looked down at my midnight blue silk gown. It did not have a flashy logo plastered across the chest because it was custom made for me by a private designer in Milan, costing more than Marcus made in 3 months. But Marcus only understood wealth if it came with a loud, recognizable brand name. I calmly pulled my arm out of his grasp. "I am not changing my dress, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. He glared at me, his nostrils flaring. "You are always trying to ruin things for me," he muttered. "I need this networking dinner. I need to impress these people, and you standing there looking like a nobody is not helping." Just as Marcus was straightening his tie, attempting to regain his composure, a sharp, condescending voice cut through the cool night air. "I told you, Marcus. This is what you get when you marry a girl who went to a public state college instead of a prestigious private university." It was my mother-in-law, Beatrice. She walked up to us wearing far too much jewelry, her nose turned up as if the very air around me was offensive. Beatrice was the epitome of fake Atlanta elite. She loved to brag about her family lineage and social standing, completely ignoring the fact that her own son was drowning in credit card debt just to maintain their facade. She stopped in front of me, her eyes sweeping over me with pure disdain. "You simply cannot buy class," she said, her voice loud enough for passing guests to hear. She turned her attention to Marcus, brushing a speck of imaginary dust off his lapel. "Marcus, you need to keep her away from the important conversations tonight. Preston is introducing you to the partners of a major private equity firm. The last thing we need is for your wife to open her mouth and show her lack of education. Do not let her talk about her little work-from-home data entry job. It is embarrassing to our family name." I stood there and took a slow, deep breath. For 5 years I had listened to Beatrice insult my background. For 5 years I had let them believe that I was just a lowly freelance accountant, typing numbers into spreadsheets from my home office. They thought I was a failure because I did not climb the corporate ladder the way Marcus did. They had no idea that my data entry actually involved managing a multi-billion-dollar real estate portfolio. They did not know that I was the founder and majority shareholder of Aura Capital, the very private equity firm they were all desperately trying to impress tonight. I was about to walk into the lobby when Marcus suddenly perked up like an eager puppy. "Ah, here comes Preston," he whispered excitedly. "My brother-in-law." Preston walked through the doors with his wife Chloe, my husband's sister, clinging to his arm. Preston was a white finance broker who loved nothing more than flexing his privilege and acting like the savior of his black in-laws. He had a habit of talking down to everyone, especially me. My husband and mother-in-law practically worshipped him because he gave them proximity to white corporate power, completely ignoring his blatant disrespect. Preston spotted us and strolled over, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He clapped Marcus hard on the shoulder, a gesture of dominance that Marcus eagerly accepted. "There is my guy," Preston boomed. "Ready to play with the big boys tonight, Marcus. Just follow my lead. I have got you covered with the board members." Then Preston turned his pale, watery eyes toward me. He looked me up and down, giving a short, patronizing laugh. "Zuri," he said, dragging out my name. "Do me a favor tonight. When we get to the VIP table, just sit back, eat your salad, and look pretty. Well, do your best anyway. Do not try to chime in when the adults are talking business. You do not need to worry your pretty head about complex financial terms like liquidity and leveraging. You just stick to your little data entry spreadsheets, okay?" Chloe giggled softly behind her hand, looking at my dress with obvious amusement. My husband did not defend me. He never did. Instead, Marcus chuckled along with Preston, desperate to secure his favor. "Got it," Preston, Marcus said quickly. "I have already told her to keep quiet. She knows her place." I did not yell. I did not cry. I just offered Preston a cold, empty smile. "My place," I repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose everyone will see exactly what my place is tonight." I looked past Preston's shoulder, past my sneering mother-in-law, and past my spineless husband. Across the grand marble lobby, the host of the evening, the billionaire real estate mogul, Reginald, was pushing his way through a crowd of security guards. His face was flushed, he was sweating profusely, and he was practically sprinting in our direction, his eyes locked entirely on me. The heavy, frantic thud of expensive leather shoes, echoing across the pristine marble floor of the lobby, commanded the attention of everyone in the immediate vicinity. Reginald, a man whose real estate empire dictated the skyline of the entire city, was practically sprinting toward us. I was a man who notoriously made state senators wait in his lobby for hours, yet right now his face was flushed a deep crimson, and sweat beaded visibly across his forehead. Preston immediately puffed out his chest, his posture shifting into that aggressive space-claiming stance that arrogant finance bros always adopt when they sense an opportunity to network. Preston saw a fellow wealthy white man and assumed instant inherent camaraderie. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, shot a triumphant watch and lean glance toward my husband, and stepped directly into Reginald's path. Preston flashed a blinding, perfectly bleached smile, raising a manicured hand ready to claim his moment of absolute glory. "Mr. Reginald Preston," boomed his voice, unnaturally loud and dripping with false familiarity. "An absolute honor, sir. I am Preston Vance. We have a mutual associate at the equity board who said I simply must introduce myself tonight." Reginald did not even blink. He did not slow his pace by a single fraction of a second. He blew past Preston with such aggressive momentum that the rush of air physically fluttered the fabric of Preston's jacket. It was as if Preston was completely invisible, a minor ghost hovering in the hallway. Preston's outstretched hand remained suspended in the empty air, the arrogant smile freezing on his pale face before slowly cracking into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. I tracked the movement perfectly, my gaze whipping from Preston's stunned, reddening features to the towering figure of Reginald, who slammed on the brakes right in front of my velvet heels. Reginald, the billionaire titan of industry, did not just offer a polite nod. He planted his feet, straightened his arms at his sides, and executed a sharp, rigid 90-degree bow directly to me. "Madam CEO," Reginald gasped, his chest heaving heavily beneath his suit as he struggled to catch his breath. "I am so incredibly sorry. I am horrified by this oversight. The security team at the front gate failed to alert my personal staff that your vehicle had pulled up. If I had known you were arriving at this exact moment, I would have been waiting at the curb myself to escort you inside. Please accept my deepest apologies. Your usual VIP table is completely prepped, secured, and waiting for you right now." The silence that fell over our little group was deafening. The ambient sound of the string quartet playing in the background seemed to fade into nothingness. Chloe's jaw practically unhinged, hanging open in a very unladylike manner as she stared at the billionaire bowing to her sister-in-law. Beatrice looked like she had just been slapped across the face with a wet towel, her hand flying up to clutch her diamond necklace in sheer horror. But it was Marcus who reacted exactly the way a weak, insecure man always reacts when his fragile worldview is suddenly and violently shattered. The blood completely drained from my husband's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Instead of awe or respect, his eyes filled with a desperate, toxic panic. He lunged forward and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging harshly into my skin through the silk of my dress. He yanked me roughly toward him, desperately trying to pull me out of Reginald's line of sight, as if he could physically hide what was happening. "What kind of trick are you pulling?" Marcus hissed, his voice trembling with a potent mix of fear and fury. His breath was hot and frantic against my ear. "How much did you pay a staff member to set this little stunt up? Are you using your ghetto street smarts again to humiliate me in front of these people? Stop this right now before you ruin my career." I stared at the hand gripping my arm. That word, ghetto. It was his favorite weapon, his default insult. Whenever I solved a complex problem he could not comprehend, whenever I negotiated a flawless contract, or whenever I simply outsmarted someone trying to take advantage of us, I was never clever or intelligent to him. I was street. I was ghetto. Because to Marcus, my public school education and my working class neighborhood meant I was inherently genetically beneath him. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of being better than my origins. He prized his massive private school debt over my quiet financial freedom. He honestly believed down to his very core that the only possible way a black woman from my background could get a billionaire to bow to her was through some cheap, deceitful, low-class scam. I looked up from his white-knuckled grip and locked my eyes onto his panicked, bloodshot gaze. "Let go of my arm, Marcus," I said. My voice was completely calm, devoid of any shouting or hysterics, but it carried the chilling weight of an absolute command. Marcus recoiled as if my skin had suddenly turned to burning iron. He snatched his hand back instantly, taking a stumbling step away from me, though his chest continued to heave with panicked, shallow breaths. He looked at me as if he was seeing a stranger, someone dangerous and entirely unknown. That was when Preston decided to step in. Because of course Preston could not stand by and let a situation play out without inserting his own perceived authority. To an arrogant finance broker like Preston, a black woman holding ultimate power was a glitch in the matrix, a clerical error that needed to be swiftly and loudly corrected by a sensible white man. He could not process the fact that Reginald had ignored him to worship me, so his ego demanded that he frame it as a comical mistake. Preston let out a loud, patronizing chuckle, stepping firmly between me and Reginald, as if to physically shield the billionaire from my apparent deception. "Mr. Reginald Preston," boomed, his voice dripping with that familiar, nauseating condescension he always reserved for me. "I believe there has been a massive misunderstanding here. You are clearly confusing this woman with someone else of importance." Preston gestured loosely toward me, a dismissive, mocking flick of his wrist. "This is Zuri. She is just Marcus's wife. She does not own anything, and she certainly does not run anything. She sits at her kitchen table in sweatpants doing freelance data entry for pennies. She is basically just a low-level employee trying to play dress-up for the night. You really do not need to waste your time apologizing to her." I watched Preston's face, memorizing the absolute certainty in his eyes. He felt so powerful in that moment, so convinced of his inherent superiority. He was putting the little data entry girl back in her box, performing his role as the white savior protecting the billionaire from a peasant scam. He smiled at Reginald, expecting a shared laugh, expecting a pat on the back for clearing up the confusion. Reginald slowly straightened his posture. The fearful, subservient demeanor he had displayed while addressing me vanished in a fraction of a second. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of pure corporate ruthlessness. He turned his head slowly toward Preston, and the look in his eyes was lethal. It was the look of an apex predator assessing a very stupid, very loud, and very annoying insect. Reginald stepped directly into Preston's personal space, radiating an aggressive authority that forced the taller man to instinctively take a step backward. The smug smile on Preston's face shattered entirely, replaced by a sudden dawning terror as he realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Who exactly are you?" Reginald demanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that carried absolute menace, commanding the attention of everyone standing in the lobby. "And who gave you the audacity to speak so insolently to the founder, the majority owner and the largest shareholder of this entire real estate portfolio. The silence that fell over the grand lobby was absolute thick enough to choke on. Preston's mouth opened and closed, his jaw working uselessly, as if all the oxygen had suddenly been sucked from the room. The arrogant flush of his skin vanished, replaced by a sickly translucent pallor. He looked from Reginald to me, his pale eyes darting wildly, trying to find the punchline to a joke that did not exist. Marcus stood completely paralyzed. His hands trembled violently at his sides, his meticulously polished shoes seemingly glued to the marble floor. The man who had spent the entire car ride lecturing me on networking and social hierarchy now looked as though he was about to vomit directly onto his custom Italian loafers. Reginald did not wait for Preston's non-existent recovery. He turned his back on my brother-in-law with a chilling finality, offering his arm to me with the utmost reverence. "Right this way, Madam CEO," Reginald said, his voice instantly softening into a tone of absolute respect. "We have kept the center table waiting for your arrival." I placed my hand lightly on Reginald's arm and began to walk. Behind me, I could hear the panicked, shuffling footsteps of my husband and his family. They followed us not like invited guests, but like prisoners being marched toward the gallows. We passed through the soaring archways into the main ballroom, and the sheer scale of the event unfolded before us. The camera of my reality seemed to pull back, gliding smoothly away from the VIP table to reveal a breathtaking sea of wealth. Thousands of crystals dripped from massive chandeliers, casting a warm, golden illumination over perfectly arranged tables dressed in heavy silk and fine bone china. This was not just a dinner. This was a gathering of apex predators. Every titan of industry, every tech billionaire, and every political kingmaker in Atlanta was seated in this room. And as I walked down the center aisle, their eyes followed me. Marcus stumbled into the chair beside me at the VIP table, his breathing shallow and rapid. Chloe sank into her seat across from us, her designer gown suddenly looking incredibly cheap against the backdrop of true unrestricted power. Preston sat rigidly next to her, staring blankly at his empty crystal water glass, his mind completely broken by the reality that the woman he had just ordered to sit back and look pretty was the sovereign ruler of this entire domain. Reginald wasted no time. He strode directly up the velvet steps onto the main stage, the bright stage lights catching the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He approached the podium, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the sprawling ballroom. The quiet hum of networking and clinking silverware died down instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reginald's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing off the hand-painted ceilings. "For years we have gathered in this room to celebrate the growth of our beautiful city. We have toasted to new skylines, to groundbreaking acquisitions, and to the relentless drive of the enterprises represented at these tables. But tonight is different. Tonight is historic." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Marcus flinched beside me, pressing his back hard against his chair, as if trying to merge with the upholstery. Beatrice leaned forward, her brow furrowed in deep, uncomfortable confusion. She was desperately trying to make sense of a world that was rapidly slipping out of her control. "For the past 5 years," Reginald continued, his voice vibrating with intense pride, "Aura Capital has moved like a silent tidal wave through the financial sector. They have funded our largest developments, rescued our failing institutions, and redefined what it means to build generational wealth in this country. And yet the brilliant architect behind this massive empire has always chosen to remain in the shadows. She preferred to let her ruthless acquisitions and flawless market strategies speak for her. She built a kingdom in absolute silence." Reginald paused, looking out over the sea of powerful faces, before his eyes locked directly onto mine. "But tonight," Reginald declared, throwing his hand out toward our table, "the ghost has graciously decided to step into the light. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce the true force behind our prosperity, the founder, the majority shareholder, and the sole CEO of Aura Capital." Instantly, a blinding, brilliant spotlight swung down from the rafters, cutting through the dim ambiance of the ballroom and locking directly onto me. I sat perfectly still, bathed in a circle of pure, undeniable illumination. For one suspended second, The room was entirely silent. Then the man sitting at the table adjacent to ours, the ruthless hedge fund manager who had famously ignored Marcus's emails for 3 years, pushed his chair back and stood up. He began to clap. Beside him, a state senator rose to her feet, joining the applause. Then a tech billionaire. Then a media mogul. Like a cascading wave of profound reverence, every single person in that sprawling, magnificent ballroom stood up. The applause swelled into a deafening, thunderous roar, shaking the very crystal in the chandeliers above us. They were not just clapping. They were offering a standing ovation to the woman my husband had ordered to remain silent. Marcus sat frozen in the blinding glare of my spotlight, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a terror so deep it looked as though it was crushing his soul. He was trapped in the center of a standing ovation meant for the wife he despised, surrounded by the exact men he worshipped, all of whom were currently bowing to my authority. But Beatrice could not handle it. The cognitive dissonance was too violent for her fragile elitist ego to process. Her entire worldview, built on the absolute certainty that public school girls from working-class neighborhoods were genetically inferior, was being publicly dismantled. Her face twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate panic. She lunged across the table, her long manicured nails digging fiercely into my forearm. "Stop this!" Beatrice hissed through her clenched teeth, her voice a frantic, venomous whisper barely audible over the roaring applause. "Sit down right now. You are making a fool of us. What kind of sick trick is this? Where did you get this money? Are you embezzling from Marcus? Did you drain my son's accounts to pay for this ridiculous charade?" Her grip tightened, her nails biting into my skin. "This is exactly what you do," she spat, her eyes wild with delusion. "You steal. You stole my son away from the proper high society girls he was supposed to marry, and now you are stealing his money to pretend you are something you will never be. You are a fraud. Sit down before I call security and have you arrested for theft." I looked down at the desperate, clawing hand on my arm. Then I looked at Beatrice, my face devoid of any emotion. I did not flinch. I did not pull away quickly. I simply reached over, gripped her wrist with absolute unyielding force, and peeled her fingers off my skin. I shoved her hand back toward her with such deliberate authority that she stumbled back into her chair, gasping for air as if I had physically struck her. I stood up. The moment I rose from my chair, the applause reached a fever pitch. I stood tall in the center of the blinding light, smoothing the silk of my custom gown. I reached down and picked up my crystal champagne flute, holding it effortlessly by the stem. The light caught the golden liquid, refracting fiercely as I turned my body slightly to face the room. I raised the glass and the thunderous applause slowly began to taper off, replaced by a rapt, expectant silence. Every billionaire, every power player, every elite guest waited with bated breath for me to speak. "Thank you," I said. My voice was calm, melodic, and completely amplified by the silence of the room. "It is a profound honor to finally step out from behind the spreadsheets and celebrate the tremendous growth we have achieved together." Aura Capital was built on the principle of recognizing true value, stripping away the noise, and eliminating liabilities. I look forward to continuing that aggressive standard with all of you. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the tension in the room stretch tight. Then I lowered the glass and pivoted my body, locking my eyes directly onto the sweating, trembling figure of my brother-in-law. Preston sat frozen, his skin practically glowing with a sickly, terrified sweat. "And speaking of aggressive standards," I continued, my voice echoing crystal clear across the silent ballroom, "I would like to extend a very special personal thank you to my brother-in-law, Preston Vance." Every head in the room swiveled toward Preston. Chloe shrank back in her seat, trying to physically distance herself from the man she had just been clinging to. "Just this morning," I said, a slow, razor-sharp smile spreading across my face, "Preston submitted an urgent proposal to my private acquisition team at Aura Capital. He is desperately seeking a $20 million bailout for his latest commercial real estate venture. A venture that, according to my internal risk assessors, is currently drowning in leveraged debt." Preston's mouth dropped open. A strangled, choking sound escaped his throat, but no words formed. The elite guests around us began to murmur, casting judgmental, predatory glances at the man whose financial ruin was being broadcast live. "So, Preston," I asked, tilting my head slightly, my voice dripping with lethal sweetness, Since you were so kind to offer me career advice in the lobby tonight, I thought I should consult you on this matter directly. Tell me exactly how would you like me to data enter your request for $20 million? Should I categorize it under bad investments or simply under charity? The color drained entirely from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing gasp came out as the entire ballroom of billionaires erupted into a chorus of low, mocking laughter. The laughter in the ballroom was not warm. It was the cold, clinical amusement of apex predators watching a wounded animal thrash in a trap. Preston stood completely paralyzed as the mocking sound washed over him. The red flush of his cheeks drained away, leaving a sickly mottled gray in its wake. He looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the very board members and equity partners he had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to impress. They were not smiling with him. They were looking at him as if he were a particularly unpleasant stain on the marble floor. But men like Preston are uniquely conditioned to never accept defeat. They are raised with a dangerous, unearned confidence that tells them they can talk their way out of any room, especially if the person standing across from them is a woman of color. I watched the exact moment his survival instinct kicked in. He squared his shoulders, puffed out his chest, and tugged sharply at the hem of his tuxedo jacket. He forced a stiff, unnatural chuckle from his throat, attempting to project the illusion that we were merely engaged in some high-level, playful banter between financial equals. Very entertaining, Zuri, Preston said, his voice straining to find its usual booming resonance. I have to admit you played the long game very well. A brilliant corporate roast. But let us bring the conversation back down to reality for a moment. I know you are sitting in the big chair tonight, but commercial real estate acquisition is a vastly different arena than whatever administrative ledgers you are used to managing. I took a step forward, trying to physically loom over me, utilizing the classic intimidation tactic of the mediocre white knight. He lowered his voice into a patronizing educational register, entirely oblivious to the fact that Reginald the billionaire mogul was still standing respectfully at attention a few feet away. Zuri, you simply do not understand the complex financial architecture behind a proposal of this magnitude. Preston continued, raising a hand as if to silence any interruption I might attempt. We are talking about high-level liquidity mechanics and advanced financial leveraging. The $20 million I requested is not a bailout. It is a strategic market consolidation. My project utilizes mezzanine debt structures to maximize yield in developing urban corridors. It is aggressive, yes, but it is standard practice. You cannot just glance at a balance sheet and comprehend the broader economic vision. You have to understand the nuances of urban redevelopment. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply lifted my hand and gave a subtle two-finger signal to the audiovisual team stationed in the balcony above. Instantly, the massive floor-to-ceiling digital screens that spanned the walls of the ballroom flickered. The elegant gold-embossed logo of the gala vanished. In its place, projected in brilliant high definition for every billionaire, senator, and investor in the room to see, was the confidential internal financial dossier of Preston Vance's real estate firm. The collective sharp intake of breath from the audience was audible. Preston froze his neck, snapping around to stare at the 50-foot projection of his own classified ledgers. Let us talk about your broader economic vision, Preston. And I said, my voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. Since you assume I lack the capacity to understand liquidity, allow me to translate your business model for the room. You are not consolidating markets. You are running a predatory exploitation ring. I gestured toward the screen, reading the figures from memory, without even needing to look. Your liquidity is non-existent because your debt-to-equity ratio is currently sitting at an astronomical 9-to-1. You have leveraged your firm into a corner, taking out high-interest unregulated loans through 3 separate offshore shell companies. And why did you need those shadow companies, Preston? Because no reputable domestic bank would touch your portfolio with a 10-foot pole after your last default. Preston began to sweat profusely. Drops of moisture beaded on his forehead and rolled down his pale neck, staining the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He opened his mouth to object, but his vocal cords seemed completely paralyzed. I stepped closer to him, closing the distance, forcing him to look me in the eye. But the debt is not even the most repulsive part of your portfolio. I continued, ensuring my voice carried to the furthest corners of the ballroom. Let us look at how you acquire these properties. Your strategy relies entirely on targeting minority-owned small businesses in gentrifying neighborhoods. You approach Black and brown owners who are struggling with temporary cash flow issues. You offer them bridge loans with buried extortionate variable interest rates that you know they will inevitably fail to meet. You manufacture artificial defaults, foreclose on their generational assets for pennies on the dollar, and immediately flip the properties to commercial developers. I let the weight of the revelation settle over the crowd. The silence in the room had shifted from amused shock to absolute chilling disgust. Even in a room full of ruthless capitalists, there were lines of professional ethics and legal compliance that were not crossed. Preston was not a savvy investor. He was a bottom feeder. You did not come to Aura Capital for a strategic partnership, Preston, I stated, my tone devoid of any mercy. You came begging for $20 million to cover the margin calls on your fraudulent loans before your shadow lenders break your kneecaps. You thought you could blind a faceless corporate entity with buzzwords and fake projections. You never imagined that the CEO reading your pathetic predatory scheme would be a Black woman from the exact same public school neighborhoods you are currently trying to destroy. Stop it! A shrill, hysterical voice shattered the tension. Chloe leaped out of her chair, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage and humiliation. She stumbled forward, her expensive heels catching on the carpet, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. You are lying! Chloe screamed, her voice echoing wildly across the formal dining space. You have always been jealous of us, Suri. You have always hated Preston because he comes from a good family and actually knows how to make real money. You are just using your little newfound power to humiliate my husband. You are making all of these numbers up just to ruin him. This is slander. You are slandering my husband in front of the entire city. Marcus remained glued to his chair. He did not reach out to pull his sister back. He did not defend me. He simply stared at his hands, his cowardice completely exposed. He was watching his entire social and financial foundation burn to the ground, and he was too weak to even stand up. I looked at Chloe's tear-streaked, furious face. She was completely ignorant of the financial world, willfully blind to the source of the wealth she so desperately flaunted. She only cared that her illusion of superiority was being dismantled. I offered her a cold, polite smile, the kind of smile that offers absolutely no comfort. I am not making anything up, Chloe, I said softly. And I am certainly not slandering your husband. Slander is spoken. If I were publishing these documents myself, it would be libel. But projecting a man's own verified financial records back to him is just transparent corporate governance. I turned my attention back to Preston, who was now visibly shaking his eyes, darting frantically toward the ballroom exits, as if calculating the distance to the doors. Besides, I added, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that commanded absolute stillness from the audience. You are giving me far too much credit if you think my goal tonight was simply to embarrass you at a dinner party. That would be a waste of my time. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. What did you do? He whispered, his voice cracking. I rejected your proposal at 7 o'clock this morning, I replied smoothly. But before I closed the file, I had my legal team compile every single fraudulent loan application, every hidden shell company ledger, and every extortionate foreclosure contract you submitted to our servers. I bundled it all into a very neat, very comprehensive package. I took a step back, allowing the full weight of his destruction to crash down upon him. I am not slandering you, Preston, I said, my smile fading entirely. I am just providing you with a courtesy update. I sent all of that evidence directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission this morning. My legal team assures me that the federal agents will have secured warrants to raid your offices by dawn tomorrow. I raised my champagne flute one last time, holding it out toward him in a mocking toast. I highly suggest you enjoy your last glass of champagne, Preston. Where you are going, the vintage is significantly less refined. The sound of 100 billionaires laughing at a man's financial ruin is a uniquely terrifying noise. It is cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of pity. Preston physically crumpled under the weight of it. He took a stumbling step backward, his face flushed a mottled, ugly purple. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at my mother-in-law. He simply turned and practically sprinted toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, desperate to escape the room before the federal agents arrived at his office. Chloe let out a sharp, humiliated sob and buried her face in her hands, her illusion of a perfect, wealthy marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I watched them fall apart with absolute clarity. But the most repulsive display of the evening was just beginning. As the laughter began to subside, settling back into an expectant, electrified hum, I felt a warm, sweaty palm slide over my knuckles. I turned my head. Marcus had risen from his chair and stepped directly into the spotlight beside me. His posture had completely transformed. The man who had grabbed my arm and called me ghetto just 10 minutes ago was gone. In his place stood the ultimate opportunistic parasite. He puffed out his chest, plastering on a bright, incredibly fake smile for the surrounding elite. He looked at me with an expression of manufactured adoration that made my stomach churn. "I knew it," Marcus announced, pitching his voice loud enough for the hedge fund managers at the next table to hear. "I always knew you were an absolute genius, Zuri, my incredible, brilliant wife." He squeezed my hand, attempting to pull me closer to his side, to present us as a united front. "I knew you were keeping this a secret for a strategic reason. These people did not respect you tonight, but I always did. We are a team, baby. We have always been a team. With my executive background in banking and your capital, there is no limit to what we can build. Just let me step in and help you manage these new assets." I stared at his sweaty, eager face. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words hung in the air between us. He was actually trying to ride my coattails, desperately trying to rebrand his years of financial abuse and verbal degradation as unwavering support. I looked down at his hand, enveloping mine. I stared at the simple gold wedding band on my ring finger, a symbol of a vow he had broken 1,000 times over. I did not smile. I violently yanked my hand out of his grasp. I stepped back, severing the physical connection so abruptly that Marcus stumbled forward a fraction of an inch. "A team," I repeated. My voice carried a dangerous, quiet edge that caused the remaining chatter at the surrounding tables to instantly die out. The titans of Atlanta industry were now watching us with rapt, absolute attention. "Is that what we are, Marcus A-team?" Marcus swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering for a second before he tried to force it back. "Of course we are, Zuri. We are husband and wife." "That is fascinating," I said, tilting my head, because I was under the impression that a team actually consults one another before liquidating shared assets. "Tell me, Marcus, was it a team decision when you completely drained our joint savings account last Tuesday? Or was that a solo executive move?" The color began to drain from his face again, returning him to that sickly ashen gray. "Zuri, keep your voice down," he hissed through a forced grin, terrified of the powerful audience witnessing this. "You do not know what you are talking about. We can discuss our private finances at home." "Oh, we are going to discuss them right here," I stated, my voice ringing out clear and authoritative, "because I am very curious to know if it was a team decision to purchase a brand new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne for a 22-year-old girl named Lexi." A collective gasp rippled through the VIP section. A few tables away, a prominent female senator raised her eyebrows over the rim of her wine glass, highly entertained by the spectacular collapse of my husband's ego. Marcus looked as though the floor had suddenly vanished beneath his feet. His eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the judgmental stares of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The mask of the polished, successful bank manager disintegrated entirely. He reverted to his default setting of manipulation and gaslighting. He stepped toward me, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. "Are you crazy?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with panic and raw indignation. "You are having a hysterical breakdown. You let this little bit of power go straight to your head, and now you are just making up insane delusions to embarrass me. Who fed you these lies? Which one of your jealous, low-class friends told you this garbage?" I did not yell back. I did not flinch. I reached into my midnight blue silk clutch. My fingers bypassed my lipstick and brushed against a thick folded stack of documents I had been carrying all evening. I pulled the papers out, out, gripped them firmly, and slammed them down directly onto the pristine white tablecloth in front of him. Glossy photographs spilled across the table showing Marcus handing a set of car keys to a blonde girl barely out of college. Beside the photos lay highlighted bank statements, transfer logs, and property deeds. "Nobody fed me anything," I said, my voice echoing with total inescapable finality. "And I did not need to hire a private investigator to track your pathetic little affairs." Marcus stared down at the documents, his breath catching in his throat, as he recognized his own signature on the transfer papers. "Because I own Sterling Fidelity," I declared, naming the exact financial institution where he worked. "I bought the majority shares of that bank 8 months ago. I am your ultimate employer, Marcus. I initiated a full forensic audit on your entire department 3 months ago. I have seen every single fraudulent expense, every hidden transfer, and every stolen dollar you ever processed." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. Marcus stared at the glossy photographs and the highlighted bank statements as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. The realization that I was not just his wife, but the ultimate owner of Sterling Fidelity, the very institution he had been systematically robbing, seemed to physically break him. He slumped back into his chair, his shoulders caving inward, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending ruin. He had spent years treating me like an ignorant subordinate, entirely unaware that I held the keys to his entire professional and legal existence. He could not even muster the breath to form an excuse. He just stared blankly at the financial logs that detailed every expensive dinner, every luxury hotel room, and every stolen wire transfer he had funneled to his 22-year-old mistress. Suddenly, the sharp scraping of a chair violently pushed back against the marble floor shattered the quiet. Beatrice, whose face had been contorting through various stages of shock, disbelief, and horror, could no longer contain herself. I watched her expression morph into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. Her eyes were wide, her nostrils flaring as she looked from the undeniable evidence on the pristine tablecloth to her trembling, pathetic son. But Beatrice was a creature built entirely on denial and elitist conditioning. Instead of holding her son accountable for his corporate crimes and his blatant infidelity, her deeply ingrained toxic pride demanded a target she felt comfortable attacking. Me. She lunged forward, slamming her hands flat onto the table, leaning across the fine crystal glasses to glare directly into my face. Her breathing was ragged, her carefully styled hair trembling slightly as she prepared to defend the completely indefensible. The polite facade of the Southern matriarch vanished, leaving behind nothing but raw, ugly prejudice. "You listen to me, you spiteful, ungrateful girl!" Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with a desperate, venomous fury. Men stepping out is completely normal. It is a biological reality that men of power seek distractions. A woman of actual class, a woman raised with proper values, knows how to turn a blind eye and protect her husband's public reputation. You are his wife. Your only duty was to preserve his dignity and save face for this family. Instead, you drag our private matters into a ballroom just to feed your own massive ego. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice to match her rising hysteria. I simply let her expose the deeply rotten core of her ideology to the entire room of influential guests. The titans of industry seated at the surrounding tables watched the spectacle with quiet, predatory fascination. Beatrice was practically vibrating with rage, her knuckles turning bone white as she pressed her weight into the table. She was trying to deploy the only weapons she had left. She was trying to remind me of my place. "So what if you somehow stumbled into some money?" Beatrice continued, her voice rising in pitch, completely abandoning the polished high society etiquette she claimed to champion. "You think buying a bank makes you our equal. You think a lucky investment erases where you came from. You will never have the aristocratic blood of this family running through your veins. You can buy all the designer silk in Milan. You can throw around all the corporate titles you want, but you will always be that exact same commoner with no lineage and no pedigree. That historical mansion I live in, the ancestral estate that has defined our family name for generations, is a legacy of pure class that a nouveau riche, classless upstart like you could never ever reach." She spat the words out as if they were holy truth, clinging desperately to the bricks and mortar of her home as the ultimate proof of her superiority. For 5 years, Beatrice had used that grand historical mansion in Buckhead as a physical weapon against my self-esteem. She had forced me to enter through the side doors during family gatherings. She had made me sit at the furthest ends of her dining table, constantly reminding me that I was a peasant allowed temporary access to a castle I could never truly inhabit. That house was the very center of her arrogance. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly reached out, wrapped my fingers around the slender stem of my crystal champagne flute, and lifted it to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp, cold liquid slide down my throat, while Beatrice stood there panting, waiting for my reaction. I carefully set the glass back down on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the tablecloth. "You are exactly right, Beatrice," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling melodic calm that cut through her frantic energy. "You made it abundantly clear from the very first day we met that I was not worthy of stepping foot inside that magnificent historical mansion. You reminded me at every holiday, at every dinner, and at every passing opportunity that your home was a sanctuary of wealth that my kind could never attain." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, closing the distance between us. And because you established that absolute boundary, I continued, my eyes locking onto hers with unyielding precision. Marcus felt perfectly secure in assuming I would never look closely at the property records. He knew I would never dare to investigate the financial standing of your precious ancestral estate. Beatrice frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion disrupting her rage. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her gaze darting rapidly between me and her son. I shifted my focus to Marcus. He was practically hyperventilating now, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. The sweat was pouring down his face, ruining his expensive collar. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the lever being pulled. "Tell her, Marcus," I commanded softly. "Tell your mother how you funded your little 22-year-old distraction. Tell her how you managed to purchase a $150,000 Porsche Cayenne in straight cash when your bank division was underperforming." Marcus choked on his own breath. He shook his head frantically, his eyes pleading silently with me to stop, to spare him this final, ultimate humiliation. But I had spent 5 years being the collateral damage of his insecurities. I was entirely out of mercy. "Since my husband seems to have lost his voice, I will explain the mechanics of his betrayal," I said, turning my attention back to Beatrice. "The problem with embezzling from a bank, especially a heavily regulated institution like Sterling Fidelity, is that eventually the ledgers have to balance. You cannot just steal hundreds of thousands of dollars to play sugar daddy without creating a massive, highly illegal deficit." 3 months ago, when Marcus realized an internal audit was imminent, he panicked. He needed a massive influx of untraceable liquidity to cover his stolen funds and avoid federal prison. Beatrice's breath hitched. She slowly turned her head to look at her golden son, the first seeds of profound terror taking root in her aristocratic mind. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice suddenly hollow and fragile. "What did you do?" "I did what any desperate, cowardly man would do," I answered for him. He realized that his mother lived alone in a massive, debt-free historical mansion, a property with enormous untapped equity. And since he held your general power of attorney to assist with your medical paperwork, he quietly bypassed you entirely. He secretly took out a massive, high-interest predatory commercial mortgage against your beloved ancestral estate. He used the cash to quietly replace the money he stole from the bank, leaving your home bearing the burden of his crimes. Beatrice physically recoiled as if she had been shot. She clutched her chest, her mouth opening in a silent scream. She stared at Marcus, her eyes begging him to deny it, begging him to call me a liar. But Marcus just squeezed his eyes shut and let his head drop, unable to look at the mother he had financially ruined. "Are you insane?" Beatrice gasped, her voice barely a rasp. She lunged toward him, grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo and shaking him violently. "Tell me she is lying, Marcus. Tell me you did not put a mortgage on my home. Who told you this? Who told you these lies?" She whirled back around to face me, her eyes wild, her aristocratic composure completely shredded. "I will call the police. I will have that fraudulent loan canceled. I will report whoever approved that illegal mortgage. No one told me anything." "Beatrice," I said, leaning back in my chair, projecting absolute terrifying authority. And you cannot report the lender because the shadow financial firm that approved that desperate high-risk mortgage was a quiet, aggressive little subsidiary entirely owned by Aura Capital. Beatrice froze. The fight completely left her body. The realization hit her with the concussive force of an avalanche. She let go of Marcus's jacket, her hands dropping limply to her sides. I audited Marcus 3 months ago. I continued, my voice ringing with total finality. I saw the massive deficit. I watched him panic. I watched him sign the mortgage documents. And I personally approved the acquisition of that bad debt. You see, Beatrice Marcus defaulted on that predatory loan exactly 30 days ago. The grace period expired this morning. I offered her a cold, empty smile. That historical mansion, that pristine aristocratic legacy that you said a classless upstart like me could never reach. It officially cleared the foreclosure registry at noon today. That mansion now belongs entirely to me. The absolute silence that followed my words was profound, heavy with the suffocating weight of total ruin. Beatrice stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on me with a horrified, vacant stare. The historical mansion, the sprawling estate that had served as the very foundation of her aristocratic identity, was gone. Her entire sense of self, built upon the exclusion of people like me, had just been legally and financially eviscerated. She swayed on her feet, clutching the edge of the table to keep from collapsing into a heap of designer silk and shattered pride. But while Beatrice was paralyzed by the loss of her ancestral home, Chloe was experiencing a violent psychological rupture. Her brain simply could not process the overlapping layers of absolute destruction happening all around her. Her husband Preston was fleeing the building to await federal indictment. Her brother-in-law was an exposed embezzler. Her mother-in-law was effectively a squatter. The immaculate high society narrative she had weaponized against me for 5 years was currently burning to ash under the bright chandelier lights. Chloe snapped. A guttural, unhinged shriek tore from her throat, a sound so raw and ugly that several elite guests at the surrounding tables physically recoiled. Her face twisted into a mask of pure feral hatred. With zero regard for the hundreds of billionaires and political power brokers watching her, Chloe lunged. She scrambled over the edge of the velvet chair, her arms flailing, her manicured fingers curled into claws aimed directly at my face. She wanted to physically tear the calm expression off my features, desperate to inflict some kind of damage to regain control. I did not flinch. I did not even raise a hand to defend myself. I did not have to. Before Chloe could close even half the distance between us, the shadows behind me moved with terrifying, brutal efficiency. Reginald's private security detail men, who were trained to protect high-value assets, with zero hesitation, intercepted her mid-air. Two massive men in tailored black suits caught her by the arms, twisting her wrists backward with a sharp synchronized motion that forced her abruptly to a halt. Chloe screamed in shock and pain as they pushed her firmly downward, forcing her into a humiliating, subjugated crouch right on the ballroom floor. She thrashed against their iron grips, her expensive gown tangling around her knees, sobbing wildly as the entire Atlanta elite watched her disgrace with cold, silent judgment. Marcus stared at his sister, watching her being restrained like a violent criminal. He looked at his mother, who was currently hyperventilating against the edge of the table. Then he looked at me. He looked at the woman standing untouched in the blinding spotlight. The woman who commanded the respect of every billionaire in the room. The woman who owned the bank he worked for, and the house his mother slept in. And in that moment, the fear in Marcus's eyes morphed into something entirely different. It morphed into a rabid, desperate, parasitic greed. His survival instinct, honed by years of entitlement, finally found a lifeline. He realized the sheer magnitude of the wealth I controlled, and his deeply ingrained patriarchal arrogance convinced him that he was still entitled to a piece of it. "You think you have won!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you can just orchestrate all of this and leave me with nothing? You are forgetting one massive, undeniable fact, Suri. You are my wife." He took a step forward, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a sudden manic hope. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the hedge fund managers and corporate titans, desperately seeking validation for his legal theory. We live in a state with equitable distribution laws. Marcus shouted, his voice echoing frantically off the painted ceilings. I do not care how many shell companies you built, or how many billions of dollars Aura Capital controls. Every single asset you created, every dollar you acquired during the past 5 years was generated during the course of our marriage. It is marital property. If you have $1 billion, I will get half in court. You cannot escape me. I will drag you through a divorce so brutal you will be begging to give me my share. I own half of your empire. I did not call for the security guards to silence him. I let him scream. I let him expose the absolute depths of his pathetic, opportunistic nature to every venture capitalist and corporate litigator in the room. I listened to his desperate, greedy threats wash over the silent ballroom, savoring the profound poetic irony of his words. When he finally stopped shouting, gasping for air, and glaring at me with triumphant malice, I turned slowly away from him. I walked calmly back to my designated seat at the center of the VIP table. I smoothed the heavy silk of my custom gown and sat down with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I reached out, picked up my champagne flute, and rested it lightly against my knee. I looked past Marcus, past the restrained and sobbing Chloe, and fixed my gaze directly on my mother-in-law. I actually owe you a profound debt of gratitude, Beatrice, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the room, perfectly calm and melodic against the backdrop of their chaos. Beatrice blinked, her tear-streaked face jerking up in confusion. Marcus stopped, panting, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand why I was addressing his mother. Do you remember the morning of our wedding? Beatrice, I asked, leaning back slightly in my chair. Do you remember calling me into that sterile, suffocatingly cold conference room at your family lawyer's office, just 3 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle? Beatrice's breath hitched. The memory was clearly surfacing, bringing with it a sudden, terrifying realization. You sat across from me, I continued, ensuring the entire room could hear the story of her arrogance. And you looked at me as if I were a thief attempting to break into a vault. You told me that I was a girl from a public school with no pedigree and no assets. You told me that you knew exactly what kind of woman I was, a gold digger desperately trying to secure her future by marrying your son. I shifted my gaze to Marcus, whose face was rapidly losing whatever manic color it had just gained. You were so utterly terrified that I was going to divorce Marcus and try to claim half of his pathetic, measly $50,000 trust fund, I said, my voice dripping with cold amusement. You were so blinded by your elitist prejudice, so convinced of my inferior financial status, that you threatened to cancel the entire wedding right then and there, unless I signed a document protecting your son's vast generational wealth. Marcus's mouth dropped open. A strangled, choking sound escaped his throat. The math was finally connecting in his head. The legal reality of his own mother's actions was crashing down upon his greedy, desperate hopes. You forced me to sign a prenuptial agreement, Beatrice, I stated, the finality of the words ringing like a bell. You hired the most aggressive, ruthless contract lawyers in the city to draft an ironclad, impenetrable document. You want to make absolutely certain that a public school girl from a working-class neighborhood could never touch a single dime of the Vance family money. I raised my hand and gave a sharp, subtle signal toward the front row of the VIP section. Instantly, 3 tall figures separated themselves from the shadows of the crowd. They were high-powered corporate litigators, dressed in immaculate black suits, moving with predatory grace. They strode directly up the velvet steps and approached our table. The lead attorney reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a pristine, blue-bound legal document. He placed it gently onto the table right next to the scattered photographs of Marcus's mistress and the banking audit logs. Let me refresh your memory on the specific clauses your mother demanded, Marcus, I said, gesturing towards the document. Clause 4 subsection B stipulates that any and all corporate entities, business ventures, or capital generated by either party during the duration of the marriage shall remain the sole and exclusive property of the individual who generated it. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, holding Marcus's terrified, bulging eyes. Clause 7 explicitly waives any right to spousal support, alimony, or equitable distribution of assets in the event of a divorce. I continued relentlessly. The exact phrasing, if I recall correctly, was what is mine, and what is yours, in perpetuity. No exceptions, no loopholes. The ballroom was dead silent. The elite crowd was practically vibrating with the electric thrill of witnessing such a flawless, devastating legal trap snapping shut. "You wanted half of my empire, Marcus," I asked softly, setting the glass down. "You cannot have a single penny. Your mother made absolutely sure of it. Her arrogance, her prejudice, and her desperate need to protect $50,000 is the exact mechanism that legally shielded my multi-billion-dollar enterprise from you." Marcus stared down at the blue-bound prenuptial agreement resting on the table. He stared at his own signature scrawled confidently on the bottom line from 5 years ago. He realized that the very elitism he had used to mock and degrade me had become the impenetrable fortress protecting my wealth. He had nothing. He had no job, no bank accounts, no secret mistress car, no ancestral home, and absolutely no legal claim to the empire I had built right under his nose. The cognitive dissonance broke him. His legs simply gave out. Marcus collapsed. He dropped heavily onto his knees right there on the polished marble floor, his expensive Italian suit pooling around him. He let out a low, pathetic whimper, bowing his head in front of the entire Atlanta elite, utterly and completely destroyed by the wife he thought he could control. The lead attorney, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and eyes as cold as a winter ocean, did not step back. He stood over Marcus, staring down at the broken, kneeling man with a look of absolute professional disdain. He reached into his immaculate leather briefcase one final time. The snap of the brass locks echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent ballroom. Every billionaire, senator, and socialite leaned forward, completely captivated by the brutal, systematic dismantling of the Vance family. The attorney pulled out a thick, cream-colored dossier bound in heavy linen paper. He did not hand it to Marcus. He simply held it up, displaying the golden seal pressed into the cover. "And even if your mother had not aggressively forced my client to sign a prenuptial agreement protecting her from your limitless greed," the attorney stated, his voice a rich, booming baritone that required no microphone to command the room, "you would still walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing." Marcus slowly lifted his head. His face was a canvas of pure agony, his eyes red and leaking tears of profound, selfish terror. He stared at the heavy dossier, his jaw trembling violently. "As the lead counsel for Aura Capital," the attorney continued, his tone clinical and unyielding, "I was tasked with structuring the corporate architecture of the firm 5 years ago. My client is a visionary, Mr. Vance. She understands the necessity of absolute financial fortification. Not a single share of Aura Capital, nor any of its subsidiary holdings, real estate acquisitions, or liquid assets, is held in Zuri Vance's personal name." The attorney paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the crowd of seasoned investors, many of whom nodded in silent, appreciative approval of the legal strategy. "100% of my client's equity is locked inside an irrevocable generation skipping trust," the attorney declared, dropping the dossier onto the table next to the prenuptial agreement. "It was established in the state of Delaware 30 days prior to your wedding ceremony. My client is the sole trustee and the primary beneficiary. Because the trust is legally classified as irrevocable, the assets within it do not belong to her personal estate. Therefore, they are entirely exempt from any equitable distribution laws in the state of Georgia. She owns nothing on paper for you to claim. You cannot sue a ghost, Mr. Vance. You cannot divide a fortress you cannot enter." Marcus let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The absolute reality of his situation crushed whatever remaining fragments of hope he had desperately clung to. He was not just broke. He was buried under a mountain of federal crimes. He had embezzled millions of dollars from the bank I now owned. He had secretly mortgaged his mother's ancestral estate to cover his tracks, only to lose the mansion to my foreclosure division. His mistress was driving a car bought with stolen funds. His mother was essentially a squatter, and he was kneeling on the floor of the most exclusive gala in the city, begging for half of an empire that was legally impenetrable. I was going to federal prison, and he was going to go there with absolutely nothing. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man who had spent the entire car ride lecturing me on my social inferiority. He looked small, insignificant, and utterly devoid of the arrogant power he had always wielded against me. I felt no pity. I felt only the clean, sharp satisfaction of a ledger perfectly balanced. A sudden violent commotion near the entrance of the ballroom pulled my attention away from Marcus. The heavy carved oak doors had been thrown open. Two of Reginald's massive private security guards, the same men who had efficiently restrained Chloe just moments prior, were marching back into the room. Between them, thrashing and stumbling like a captured animal, was Preston. He had not made it to the valet. The guards dragged him forcefully down the center aisle, his custom tuxedo jacket bunched up around his shoulders, his expensive silk tie hanging askew. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the crowd of elites parted to let them through. The guards hauled him directly to the foot of the VIP stage and shoved him forward. Preston stumbled, his knees hitting the marble floor just a few feet away from where Marcus was still paralyzed in his own despair. Preston did not try to stand back up. The white knight arrogance that had defined his entire existence had been completely eradicated by the imminent threat of federal prosecution. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Zuri, please," Preston begged, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical whine. The billionaire investors watching him murmured in absolute disgust. "Please, you cannot do this. You cannot send the SEC to my office. They will freeze all my accounts. They will seize my personal assets. I will lose everything. I will go to prison. You have to call them off. You have to withdraw the complaint." I stood perfectly still in the blinding spotlight, looking down at the man who had just told me to sit back and look pretty while the men discussed real money. "I cannot withdraw a federal complaint, Preston," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And even if I could, I would not. You built a business model on destroying minority families. You deserve every single second of the federal indictment coming your way." Preston scrambled forward on his knees, his hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of prayer. He was crying now, ugly, terrified tears spilling over his cheeks. "Please, Zuri, I am begging you," Preston sobbed, his voice echoing loudly through the silent ballroom. "I am family. We are family. You cannot destroy a family. Chloe is pregnant." A collective stunned silence washed over the room. Off to the side, still being monitored by a security guard, Chloe jerked her head up. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes wide with shock. She had clearly been waiting for the right moment to announce her pregnancy to the high society elite, undoubtedly planning a lavish, catered reveal party. Having it screamed into a silent ballroom by her weeping, federally indicted husband was the ultimate desecration of her perfect social image. Preston seized on the silence, thinking he had found my weak point. He pointed a trembling finger toward his wife. "She is pregnant, Zuri," he pleaded, his voice rising in desperate hope. "She is carrying my child. You cannot send a father to federal prison. You cannot leave a pregnant woman penniless and ruined. Have some mercy. Do it for the baby. Please, I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just call off the federal agents." I looked at Preston. Then I slowly turned my head to look at Chloe. She was trembling, her hands instinctively wrapping around her flat stomach, her eyes locked on me with a mixture of terror and desperate silent pleading. She was a horrible, prejudiced woman who had spent years making me feel completely unwelcome in her presence. But looking at her in that exact moment, stripped of her wealth, her social standing, and her arrogant pride, I actually felt a genuine, fleeting pang of pity. She was tethered to a monster, and she did not even know the absolute worst of it yet. I turned my attention back to the weeping, pathetic man on the floor. "You are using your unborn child as a human shield to avoid federal prison," I stated, my voice echoing with profound, icy contempt. "That is the most repulsive thing I have witnessed tonight, Preston. And it is incredibly hypocritical considering your actions this afternoon." Preston stopped crying. His breath hitched in his throat. The desperate, pleading look in his eyes instantly morphed into a stark, blinding panic. He knew exactly what I was about to say. I looked directly at Chloe, holding her terrified gaze. "Your husband is begging me to protect his pregnant wife, Chloe," I said softly, ensuring the microphone caught every single syllable. "But I find that fascinating because Preston clearly had no intention of protecting you himself." Chloe let out a shaky, confused breath. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I gestured toward the screen above us, where Preston's fraudulent financial ledgers were still projected in brilliant high definition for the entire room to see. When Preston realized his mezzanine debt structure was collapsing this afternoon, I explained, my voice steady and surgical. When he realized that Aura Capital had flagged his proposal for fraud and that a federal audit was unavoidable, he did not rush home to comfort his pregnant wife. He did not hire a defense attorney to protect his family. He executed a wire transfer. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. I let it flutter from my fingers, watching it drift down to the marble floor, landing right between Preston and Chloe. At 4:15 this afternoon, I announced the finality of my words vibrating through the ballroom. Preston transferred exactly $500,000. It was the very last of his liquid, untraceable cash. He wired it directly to an offshore numbered account in the Grand Cayman Islands. Chloe stared at the paper on the floor. Her body was perfectly rigid. And the primary beneficiary on that offshore account is not you, Chloe, I said, delivering the final fatal blow to their marriage. The name on the account belongs to a 24-year-old real estate agent named Savannah. Preston was not planning to stay and raise a child with you. He was hiding his last $500,000 with his mistress, so he could flee the country before the SEC froze his assets. The silence in the room was so profound it felt like a vacuum. Every single billionaire, politician, and socialite stared at Preston in absolute, unvarnished horror. He had not only run a predatory business and begged for mercy using his unborn child, but he had also actively plotted to abandon his pregnant wife with nothing. Preston opened his mouth, his face a mask of sheer terror. "Chloe," he croaked, raising his hands toward her. "Chloe, baby, it is a misunderstanding. I was just hiding the money to protect it for us. I was going to send for you. You have to believe me." Chloe did not scream this time. The hysterical high society girl who had lunged at me earlier was gone. She stood up slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. The security guard stepped back, recognizing that she was no longer a threat to me. She walked forward, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, until she was standing directly over her kneeling husband. She looked down at the man she had worshipped, the man she had used to validate her own superiority, the man who was planning to leave her pregnant and bankrupt while he escaped to an island with another woman. Preston looked up at her, tears streaming down his face, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of supplication. "Baby, please," he whimpered. Chloe did not say a single word. She drew her arm back, her shoulders twisting with the sheer force of her rage, and swung. The slap sounded like a gunshot. The impact was so violent, so incredibly forceful, that Preston was physically thrown sideways. He crashed onto the marble floor, a loud, sharp crack echoing through the room as his jaw collided with the polished stone. He lay there, groaning in pain, clutching his face as a bright red handprint blossomed across his cheek. Chloe stood over him, breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stared down at the ruined, pathetic creature she had married. She did not look at me. She did not look at Marcus or Beatrice. She simply turned around, ignoring the stares of the entire Atlanta elite, and walked silently out of the ballroom, leaving her husband weeping on the floor. The sprawling ballroom remained suspended in a breathless, suffocating quiet. The soft clinking of ice in crystal glasses and the nervous shifting of silk gowns were the only sounds permeating the massive space. Marcus remained slumped on the floor, his quiet sobs of complete financial and legal defeat serving as the pathetic soundtrack to the end of the Vance family dynasty. Beatrice stood completely isolated at the edge of the VIP table. She was surrounded by the shattered remnants of her life. Her golden boy was a confessed felon awaiting federal indictment. Her historic ancestral mansion was legally my property. Her daughter-in-law had just abandoned the family in a spectacular display of public violence. Beatrice had absolutely nothing left but the delusion of her own superiority. And like a dying animal cornered by a predator, she chose to weaponize that delusion one final time. She slowly turned her back on her weeping son. She straightened her spine, forcing her shoulders back until her posture mimicked the regal, unbothered elegance she had spent a lifetime projecting. She lifted her chin, her eyes scanning the sea of faces watching her. She was looking at the titans of Atlanta high society. She was looking at hedge fund managers, media moguls, state senators, and generational wealth heirs. These were the people she hosted at her garden parties. These were the people she drank gin with at the country club. In her fractured, desperate mind, these were her people. Beatrice took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped away from the table, placing herself directly in the center of the room. Ladies and gentlemen! Beatrice projected her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into a shrill, commanding register. You have all known the Vance family for decades. You know our history. You know the blood that runs in our veins. We helped build the cultural foundation of this city. We represent tradition. We represent breeding. We represent the very class and sophistication that separates us from the common masses. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. Do not let this spectacle fool you! Beatrice shouted, her composure beginning to crack as a desperate, ugly panic bled into her words. Look at her. Look at what she truly is. She is an upstart. She is a low-born opportunist who stumbled into some new money and thinks she can buy her way into our world. She is trying to humiliate one of your own. If she can do this to my family, she will do it to yours. She has no respect for the established order. Beatrice stepped closer to the front row of onlookers, her eyes wide, practically begging for validation. We hold the real power! Beatrice pleaded, her voice echoing frantically against the vaulted ceilings. We control the social registers. We control the capital flow. I am asking you as my peers to stand with me. Boycott Aura Capital. Blacklist her subsidiaries. Starve her firms of investment. If we unite, we can strip this arrogant, classless girl of every dollar she thinks she controls. We can send her right back to the gutter where she belongs. Show her that true aristocracy cannot be overthrown by a peasant with a bank account. She finished her grand, venomous speech with her chest heaving, her eyes darting wildly from face to face. She waited for the murmurs of agreement. She waited for the protective closing of ranks that high society always promised its members. She waited for her peers to look at me with the same disgust she held in her own heart. But the ballroom gave her absolutely nothing. The silence that answered Beatrice Vance was cold, absolute, and utterly terrifying. Not a single person nodded. Not a single person raised a glass in solidarity. The billionaires and corporate predators she appealed to simply stared at her with blank, calculating indifference. Beatrice fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of the elite room she worshipped. These people did not care about her faded lineage. They did not care about her garden parties or her grandfather's historical achievements. They cared about power, yield, and liquid capital. And right now, the woman standing calmly at the VIP table controlled billions of dollars of it, while Beatrice controlled absolutely nothing. The silence stretched on, stretching Beatrice's nerves until they were ready to snap. Her confident posture began to physically deflate as the horrifying reality of her social isolation set in. Then the crowd near the center aisle began to part. The sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns seamlessly separated to make way for a single figure stepping forward. It was Eleanor Sterling, the wife of the city mayor and the undisputed matriarch of the most exclusive, impenetrable social circles in the state. Eleanor possessed the kind of vast generational wealth that made the Vance family look like middle-class tourists. Beatrice had spent the last 20 years aggressively fawning over Eleanor, desperately lobbying for committee positions, sending extravagant gifts and treating her word as absolute law. As Eleanor stepped onto the open floor, Beatrice's face instantly lit up with a pathetic, desperate hope. Her savior had arrived. Eleanor, thank God, Beatrice gasped, rushing forward, her hands outstretched to grasp the older woman's arms. Please tell them. Tell them that we do not tolerate this kind of aggressive, classless behavior in our circle. Eleanor did not extend her hands. She did not even break her stride. With a look of absolute freezing disdain, Eleanor walked right past Beatrice, as if she were completely invisible. Beatrice stumbled to a halt, her hands falling limply to her sides, her mouth falling open in shock. Eleanor glided directly up to the VIP table where I remained seated. Her stern, aristocratic features melted into a bright, remarkably warm smile. She reached out with both hands, grasping mine in a firm, deeply respectful hold. My dear Eleanor, said her voice carrying a resonant, carrying authority that instantly captivated the entire room. I have been trying to catch your eye all evening. It is wonderful to see you, Eleanor, I replied smoothly, squeezing her hands back. I hope the gala is meeting your expectations. It is phenomenal, as is everything you touch, Eleanor stated, ensuring her voice projected clearly for every listening ear. But I did not want to wait until tomorrow to deliver the news. I just received the official confirmation from the hospital board. Your philanthropic foundation's anonymous wire transfer cleared an hour ago. Eleanor turned slightly, addressing the room at large while keeping her hands firmly wrapped around mine. Thanks to Zuri's breathtaking generosity, the city will officially be breaking ground on the new pediatric oncology center next month. Eleanor announced, her tone radiating genuine admiration. She fully funded the entire multi-million-dollar initiative single-handedly. She asked for no naming rights, no press releases, and no public glory. She simply saw a desperate need in our city and filled it with unprecedented grace. A spontaneous, immediate ripple of applause broke out across the ballroom. The elite guests, the very people Beatrice had just begged to destroy me, were clapping in genuine respect. The applause rolled over the room, a physical manifestation of my absolute unshakable integration into the highest echelons of power. Eleanor waited for the applause to die down before she released my hands. She slowly turned around to face Beatrice. Beatrice was standing perfectly still, her face the color of wet ash. Her eyes darted frantically between Eleanor and me, her mind failing to process the fact that the woman she called a low-born peasant was secretly funding the largest philanthropic projects in the state. Eleanor looked at Beatrice with an expression of profound clinical disgust. "We are families of pedigree," Beatrice Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp, quiet tone that carried a terrifying weight. "But true pedigree is defined by the value you contribute to the world, the actual tangible power you wield, and the grace with which you wield it. It is not defined by empty boasting, inherited arrogance, or whatever faded historical delusion you are desperately clinging to." Eleanor took a single step toward the trembling, ruined woman. "You stand here bankrupt," Eleanor continued her words, acting as the final nails in the coffin of Beatrice's social existence. "Your son is an admitted thief who embezzled from a woman whose grace vastly exceeds your own. You have brought nothing but chaos, fraud, and profound embarrassment into this room. You asked us to protect our own kind. We are doing exactly that." Eleanor signaled to a distinguished man standing near the edge of the crowd, the chairman of the elite country club Beatrice worshipped. The man gave a slow, confirming nod. "You are a liability," Beatrice Eleanor stated, her voice as cold as absolute zero. "You are officially crossed off the membership roster for the country club. You are removed from the charity board. You are no longer welcome at the annual gala. Effective tomorrow morning, your name will be erased from every social register that matters in this city. You do not exist in our world anymore." The words struck Beatrice with the physical force of a wrecking ball. The applause from the crowd had already confirmed my victory, but Eleanor's quiet surgical excommunication completely shattered Beatrice's reality. For her entire life, Beatrice believed that her bloodline and her aristocratic posturing made her invincible. She believed that people like me, people who had to work for their survival, were inherently inferior and powerless against the old guard. But looking at Eleanor Sterling, looking at the silent, condemning faces of the Atlanta elite, the devastating truth finally pierced her delusion. Power was not a story you told about your ancestors. Power was not a side door you forced a daughter-in-law to use. Power was economic reality. Power was creating immense value, commanding capital, and shifting the landscape of a city with a single signature. I held the true power, and she held nothing but an empty, fraudulent name. The realization was too vast, too absolute for her fragile, arrogant mind to bear. Beatrice let out a hollow, gasping sound, like a woman who had just had the air violently expelled from her lungs. Her legs buckled entirely. She collapsed to the marble floor, landing in a crumpled, shivering heap just a few yards away from her weeping son. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stared blankly at the polished floor, completely paralyzed by the horrifying understanding that her life was over. She was penniless, homeless, and socially annihilated. The physical space of the ballroom seemed to expand, framing the ultimate destruction of the Vance family as a living portrait of hubris and consequence. From a wide, elevated vantage point, the contrast was staggering. I stood at the center of the brilliant chandelier light, flanked by my legal team and security, radiating an untouchable, quiet authority. Spread across the polished marble floor beneath me were the shattered remnants of an aristocratic dynasty. Beatrice lay crumpled in a catatonic heap of designer fabric. Marcus was sobbing into his hands, a broken shell of a man. Preston was curled on his side, blood pooling in his mouth from his wife's violent strike. And Chloe stood frozen at the massive oak exit doors, her hand trembling on the brass handle, trapped between the wreckage of her marriage and the chilling reality of her immediate future. I turned slightly to the lead attorney standing beside me. He anticipated the gesture, opening his leather briefcase and extracting 4 thick, heavy manila envelopes. They were sealed with the stark, imposing crest of Aura Capital's legal division. I took them into my hands. The weight of the premium paper felt grounding. These were not just documents. They were the final physical manifestations of my absolute liberation. I stepped down from the elevated VIP platform. The rhythmic click of my heels against the marble echoed like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of their privilege. The sea of billionaires and high society elites watched in breathless fascination, parting silently to give me an unobstructed path. I stopped directly in front of Beatrice. She did not look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the grout lines of the marble floor, her mind completely shattered by Eleanor Sterling's brutal excommunication. I dropped the first envelope. It landed with a soft, heavy thud inches from her trembling, manicured fingers. Then I moved to Marcus. He flinched as my shadow fell over him, but he could not bring himself to meet my gaze. I dropped the second envelope right beside his knees. I gestured to one of Reginald's security operatives. He stepped forward with military precision, taking the final 2 envelopes from my hands. He marched over to Preston, tossing one onto the floor next to his bleeding face. Then the guard walked the length of the ballroom, stopping directly in front of Chloe. She stared at the guard with wide, terrified eyes as he pressed the final envelope firmly into her shaking hands. I stood tall, letting my gaze sweep over the 4 of them. My voice, when I finally spoke, carried the cold, unforgiving edge of absolute zero. "These are formal court-ordered eviction notices," I announced, ensuring every single guest in the ballroom could hear the final judgment. "Beatrice, you have spent the last 5 years using your ancestral mansion in Buckhead as a weapon to remind me of my supposed inferiority. You made me sit at the end of your table. You forced me to enter through the side doors. You paraded your generational wealth as a shield against my existence. But as I established earlier your son secretly mortgaged that entire estate to cover his embezzlement, and he defaulted." I paused, letting the silence amplify the devastation of my next words. "That property legally transferred to Aura Capital's holding division at noon today," I stated flatly. "The mansion is mine. The grounds are mine. The side doors you forced me to use are mine. You and Marcus are officially trespassing on private property. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal belongings you can carry and vacate the premises. If you are still inside my house by tomorrow evening, I will have the Fulton County Sheriff's Department remove you by force." Beatrice let out a ragged, choking gasp, curling tighter into a ball, but she could not formulate a single word of protest. I turned my attention toward the back of the room, locking eyes with Chloe. She was gripping the envelope so tightly her knuckles were bone white. "Chloe," I called out, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "For 2 years you have bragged incessantly about your luxury penthouse in Midtown. You hosted lavish parties just to show off the panoramic views. You mocked my taste, my clothes, and my background, from the balcony of a property you did not even own. You thought your husband's status as an investment banker made you untouchable." Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head in a desperate, silent plea. "Aura Capital's commercial real estate division quietly acquired your entire residential building 6 months ago," I revealed, savoring the look of absolute shock that washed over her face. "Your lease was held through Preston's fraudulent holding company, the same company that is currently being dismantled by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Because the lease was tied to fraudulent corporate assets, it has been immediately terminated. Your eviction is not pending a grace period. It is effective tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. You do not have a home, Chloe. You have a hotel reservation to make." Preston groaned from the floor, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the pristine marble. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave out, leaving him sprawled in his own humiliation. The reality of their situation descended upon the room with crushing, undeniable gravity. They were not just facing social ruin or legal battles, they were facing literal, immediate homelessness. The aristocratic safety net they had relied upon their entire lives had been ripped away, leaving them in freefall. Marcus could not handle it. The sheer, overwhelming terror of losing his money, his job, his status, and now his home completely broke his mind. The final shred of his masculine pride disintegrated. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees. The elegant, tailored fabric of his expensive tuxedo scraped against the floor, soaking up spilled champagne and dirt. He did not care about the hundreds of cameras pointing at him or the disgusted murmurs of his former colleagues. He was operating entirely on pure animalistic desperation. He crawled across the distance separating us and threw his arms around my legs. He gripped my calves with a terrifying, crushing desperation, burying his tear-soaked face against the silk of my gown. "Zuri, please!" Marcus wailed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched screech that tore through the silent room. "Please, God, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I will do anything. Do not do this to me. Do not throw me out on the street. I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing. I will leave her. I will never speak to that girl again. I will be a better husband. We can start over. I will do whatever you want. Please just forgive me. Please, Zuri, I am begging you. Do not leave me with nothing." I was sobbing uncontrollably, his tears soaking into my dress, his entire body shaking with violent tremors. This was the man who had spent 5 years treating me like a naive, burdensome dependent. This was the man who had stolen from his own bank to fund a 22-year-old mistress, while simultaneously demanding I balance his domestic budget down to the penny. And now he was reduced to a weeping, groveling parasite clinging to my ankles in front of the entire city. I looked down at him. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual affection. I felt nothing but a profound, clinical disgust. I did not try to kick him away. I simply reached into my velvet clutch. My fingers bypassed the phone and the lipstick, closing around 2 specific items I had brought precisely for this moment. I pulled out a small, incredibly sharp pair of gold grooming scissors and a silver credit card. It was the supplementary credit card. The one Marcus had magnanimously issued to me with a strict $2,000 limit. The card he aggressively monitored. The card he demanded receipts for every time I bought groceries or household supplies. It was the ultimate symbol of his financial control over me. I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my legs. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper that forced him to look up. He raised his head. His face was red and bloated, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope that I was about to offer him a lifeline. He saw the silver credit card in my hand. He saw the gold scissors. I positioned the blades directly over the magnetic strip of the card. I held his gaze, letting him see the total, unyielding emptiness in my eyes. With a sharp, deliberate squeeze of my fingers, the scissors snapped shut. The heavy plastic cracked loudly. I cut it again and then a third time, severing the card into jagged, useless pieces. I opened my hand and let the pieces of plastic rain down onto his tear-streaked face. They bounced off his cheeks and landed in the folds of his ruined tuxedo. "Divorce." I stated my words, cutting through the air with lethal precision. "My lawyer will send the papers tomorrow morning." The pieces of the supplementary credit card settled into the folds of Marcus's ruined tuxedo, marking the absolute end of his financial tyranny. He stared at the jagged shards of plastic, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The reality of the divorce, the eviction, and his impending criminal charges had finally short-circuited his brain. He remained on his knees, a hollowed-out monument to his own arrogance. Behind him, the chaos surrounding Preston suddenly escalated. Preston had managed to push himself up from the marble floor, his jaw swelling rapidly from Chloe's vicious strike. Blood stained his teeth and his eyes darted frantically around the room. He saw the security guards moving in to clear the area, and the primal terror of federal prison completely overrode his common sense. He lunged forward, trying to shove his way past the wall of tailored black suits to reach the exit, desperately hoping to somehow outrun the financial crimes he had just been exposed for. I did not even make it 3 steps. One of Reginald's elite bodyguards, a man built like a concrete vault, stepped seamlessly into Preston's path. Preston tried to swing a desperate wild punch. The bodyguard did not flinch. He simply caught Preston's forearm, twisted it sharply, and drove his entire body weight forward. Preston was lifted off his feet and slammed face first into a nearby cocktail table. Crystal glasses shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. Champagne sprayed across the polished floor as the bodyguard pinned Preston's neck against the heavy wood, neutralizing him instantly. Preston groaned, his face pressed into the spilled alcohol, his arms locked painfully behind his back. Reginald stepped out from the crowd of onlookers. The billionaire host of the gala looked down at the writhing, bleeding man on his table and then shifted his gaze to Beatrice and Marcus. His face was a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. "Get this trash out of my ballroom," Reginald commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Cancel this entire family's membership permanently. If any of them set foot on this property or any associated venue ever again, you will have them arrested for trespassing. Throw them out." The security detail moved with terrifying synchronization. Two massive guards grabbed Marcus by the armpits, hauling him roughly to his feet. His legs were entirely useless, dragging behind him like dead weight as they pulled him backward toward the grand entrance. Another pair of guards flanked Beatrice, seizing her arms when she tried to swat them away. The matriarch of the Vance family looked completely unhinged, her hair disheveled, her expensive gown dragging through the spilled champagne as she was forcibly marched out of the high society sanctum she had once ruled. The bodyguard holding Preston hauled him upright, practically carrying the disgraced financier by his ruined lapels. I turned and walked slowly behind them, following the pathetic procession toward the massive oak doors of the ballroom. The elite guests parted seamlessly, giving me a wide, unobstructed path as I escorted my own abusers to the exit. As the guards dragged Marcus through the grand foyer, the shock finally wore off, and a venomous, humiliated rage took its place. He thrashed against the men holding him, his shoes scrambling for purchase on the marble. He twisted his neck to look back at me, his face contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl. "You lied to me!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "You hid this from me for 5 years. You lived in my house, you ate my food, and you played the role of a pathetic little housewife while you were sitting on billions of dollars. You are a sociopath. You are a liar." I did not stop walking. I maintained a steady, measured pace, stopping only when we reached the towering threshold of the main exit. The guards paused, holding the struggling men and the catatonic Beatrice at the edge of the property line. I looked at Marcus, my expression devoid of a single ounce of sympathy. "I never hid a single thing from you, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing with ringing, absolute clarity. "That is the greatest irony of your entire miserable existence. I did not operate in the shadows. I did not conceal my documents. The financial reports for Aura Capital, the acquisition ledgers, and the offshore holding accounts were sitting right there on my home office desk every single day of our marriage." Marcus stopped struggling. His eyes widened, a flicker of genuine confusion piercing through his rage. "You saw the folders," I continued relentlessly, ensuring every word drove like a spike into his ego. "You saw the spreadsheets. You physically moved them out of your way to set down your coffee cups. But you never actually looked at them. You never read a single page. Because your ingrained prejudice and your blinding arrogance convinced you that it was impossible for me to be doing anything important. You thought the work of a black woman sitting at a desk in your house was just trivial nonsense. You assumed I was managing a household budget or planning a dinner party. Your own racism and your own sexism blinded you to the fact that I was buying the very ground you walked on." I took a single step closer to him, lowering my voice to a lethal quiet register. "You defeated yourself, Marcus. Now get off my property." I gave a sharp nod to the security team. They shoved Marcus, Preston, and Beatrice forcefully out the doors and into the humid Atlanta night. The three of them stumbled onto the concrete driveway, a tangled, weeping mass of ruined privilege. The heavy carved oak doors of the ballroom slammed shut with a concussive thud, sealing them outside in the dark. The physical finality of the doors closing sent a profound wave of silence rippling through the foyer. I stood there for a brief moment, letting the cool, conditioned air wash over my face. The weight of 5 years of gaslighting, emotional abuse, and societal degradation had just been entirely lifted from my shoulders. The air felt miraculously light. I turned around and began the walk back toward the center of the ballroom. As I stepped back into the brilliant light of the chandeliers, the atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The tension and the horror had evaporated, replaced by an electric, almost reverent awe. The wealthiest and most powerful figures in the state were standing perfectly still, watching me return. Eleanor Sterling, standing near the VIP table, slowly raised her crystal flute of champagne into the air. One by one, every single billionaire, senator, and corporate titan in the ballroom followed her lead. The soft, synchronized clinking of crystal echoed through the massive space. It was a silent, unanimous toast. It was not just an acknowledgement of my wealth. It was the ultimate, undeniable induction into their ranks. They were honoring the apex predator who had just ruthlessly cleansed the room of a parasite. I offered a small, gracious nod of acknowledgement to the crowd. I glided back to my seat, the heavy silk of my gown pooling perfectly around my legs. I reached for my own glass, feeling the crisp, cold crystal against my fingers. I was ready to finally enjoy the evening, to step fully into the empire I had built. But as I raised the glass to my lips, a sharp, violent vibration pulsed against my hip. I paused, setting the glass down smoothly. I opened my velvet clutch and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. The screen was completely illuminated in a flashing, aggressive crimson red. It was a Tier 1 security override alert from the central servers of Sterling Fidelity, the bank I had just acquired, and the bank Marcus had just been fired from. My eyes scanned the rapid stream of data cascading across the red screen. My blood turned to ice water. Marcus was outside in the parking lot, but instead of fleeing, he had opened his laptop. He was currently utilizing a hidden, unauthorized backdoor protocol he had secretly coded into the bank's mainframe during his tenure as vice president. He was bypassing the frozen accounts. I was actively attempting to initiate a massive, untraceable wire transfer of $80 million directly from the bank's central liquidity reserves into an offshore crypto ledger. He was trying to drain the institution's primary vault before the federal authorities could arrive. I stared at the flashing crimson warning on my encrypted screen. $80 million. Marcus was not merely a coward. He was a spectacular, reckless fool. In his final, desperate bid for survival, he was attempting the digital equivalent of a bank robbery in broad daylight. He honestly believed that the backdoor protocol he had coded 3 years ago was invisible. He honestly believed that the woman he had spent a half-decade dismissing as a trivial, uneducated dependent would not have audited every single line of code the moment she acquired his institution. He assumed my presence at home meant a lack of presence in the boardroom. He was fatally incorrect. I did not panic. I did not shout. I simply lifted my gaze across the crowded ballroom and locked eyes with Elias, the Chief Technology Officer of Aura Capital. Elias was standing discreetly near the grand staircase, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, a sleek black tablet already resting in his hands. He was watching me with absolute focus, waiting for the command. We had anticipated this exact scenario. When Aura Capital finalized the hostile takeover of Sterling Fidelity last week, Elias and his elite cybersecurity team had immediately mapped the bank's entire digital infrastructure. They had found Marcus's hidden backdoor within 48 hours. It was an arrogant, sloppy piece of coding designed to bypass the standard authorization protocols for large-sum liquidity transfers. But instead of closing the back door and alerting him to our presence, we had weaponized it. We turned his secret escape hatch into a digital mousetrap. We created a mirrored sandbox environment, a completely isolated simulated server that looked and operated exactly like the bank's actual mainframe. We allowed him to think he was accessing the primary vault, while in reality he was stepping directly into a federal trap. I gave Elias a single sharp nod. Elias tapped the screen of his tablet once. The digital guillotine fell. I wanted the entire room to see exactly who the Vance family truly was. I wanted no room for country club gossip or high society revisionist history. I wanted an absolute, undeniable public execution of their legacy. I signaled to Reginald's audio-visual team stationed in the control booth overlooking the ballroom. They had been briefed on emergency protocols. The massive high-definition projection screens that hung above the stage, which had previously displayed the fraudulent ledgers, suddenly flickered. The soft hum of classical music in the ballroom was abruptly cut off. The elite crowd gasped and murmured as a live high-resolution security feed filled the towering screens. It was a direct camera feed from the estate's sprawling valet parking lot. There was Marcus. I was standing under the harsh, unforgiving glare of a halogen street lamp, entirely alone in the humid Atlanta night. He was using the hood of Beatrice's abandoned luxury sedan as a makeshift desk. His expensive tuxedo jacket was bunched up around his shoulders, soaked with sweat and the light drizzle that had begun to fall. He was pounding on the keys of his silver laptop with a manic, unhinged intensity. His face was illuminated by the stark white glow of the screen twisted into a mask of pure feral desperation. I picked up the microphone resting on the VIP table. For those of you wondering why Marcus Vance sprinted into the parking lot instead of defending his mother, I announced, my voice echoing coldly through the captivated silent ballroom. You are currently watching him attempt to embezzle $80 million from the central liquidity reserves of Sterling Fidelity. A collective wave of revulsion and sheer shock swept through the billionaires and hedge fund managers standing around me. They were ruthless corporate predators, but they followed the strict, unyielding laws of capital. Embezzlement from a bank's primary vault by a sitting vice president was the ultimate corporate sin. It was messy, it was stupid, and it was entirely unforgivable. On the massive screens, Marcus slammed the enter key. He threw his head back, letting out a heavy, visible exhale of triumphant relief. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He thought he had done it. He thought the $80 million was currently bouncing through encrypted servers, making its way to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands, safely beyond the reach of the SEC, the federal government, and my legal team. He thought he had just bought his freedom. His relief lasted exactly 3 seconds. The bright white glow illuminating his face from the laptop screen suddenly shifted. It turned into a glaring, violently flashing red. We could see the exact moment his entire world imploded. The high-definition camera captured the absolute terror contorting his features as the realization set in. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes wide, his mouth opening in a silent scream of denial. My cybersecurity team froze his administrative credentials 48 hours ago. I explained calmly to the mesmerized crowd, my voice echoing over the speakers. The system he just confidently logged into is a simulated decoy server built by Aura Capital. Not only did his wire transfer completely fail, but by executing that specific sequence of commands, Marcus just automatically transmitted a fully documented geo-tracked confession directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrimes Division. On the screens above us, Marcus completely lost his mind. The reality of his total destruction hit him with the force of a freight train. He slapped the side of the laptop. He pounded his fists against the keyboard, desperately hitting the escape key. He grabbed his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling so violently that the device slipped from his grasp and shattered against the wet asphalt. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the broken phone before surging back up to his feet with a primal, soundless scream of pure agony. He grabbed the heavy silver laptop with both hands. He raised it high above his head, the cords ripping out of the ports, and slammed it down onto the concrete parking lot with all of his remaining strength. The plastic chassis snapped in half. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of dead pixels. He stomped on the broken pieces, his expensive dress shoes crushing the motherboard, desperately trying to destroy the physical evidence of a crime that was already sitting permanently in a federal database. How was a cornered rat violently lashing out at his own trap? The guests in the ballroom watched in absolute horrified silence. No one felt an ounce of pity. They were watching the real Marcus Vance. Stripped of his mother's money, stripped of his unearned title, and stripped of his manufactured arrogance, he was nothing but a pathetic, incompetent thief, having a temper tantrum in the rain. Then, cutting through the thick, heavy air of the Atlanta night, came a sound that made every single person in the ballroom hold their breath. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing off the manicured, sprawling estates of Buckhead. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing sharper and more urgent. It was the high, piercing shriek of police sirens. And it was not just one squad car. It was a massive, coordinated fleet. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, the flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the tall oak trees lining the estate's private drive. The sirens grew deafeningly loud, drowning out the ambient noise of the gala, signaling the absolute undeniable end of the Vance family dynasty. The federal authorities were not just coming for Preston's fraudulent mezzanine debt companies and his blatant SEC violations. They were coming for Marcus's grand larceny. The two golden boys of Atlanta high society, the men who had spent their entire lives shielded by their mother's arrogance and their unearned privilege, were about to be loaded into the back of federal transport vehicles in front of the most powerful people in the state. The relentless flashing of red and blue police lights from that night faded into the crisp, sterile fluorescent lighting of the federal courthouse 2 months later. I walked through the heavy double doors, my heels clicking a steady, unyielding rhythm against the polished terrazzo floors. I wore a tailored, immaculate white suit. It was the color of a clean slate, a stark contrast to the destruction I had left in my wake. The steady cam of my memory would have captured a woman who had finally shed the suffocating weight of the Vance family expectations, walking with the posture of an apex predator inspecting her territory. As I passed the courthouse cafeteria on my way to the hearing, I paused. Standing behind the espresso machine, wiping down the stainless steel counter with a stained gray rag, was Chloe. The transformation was startling. The woman who had spent years mocking my wardrobe and bragging about her penthouse was now wearing a cheap generic uniform polo, her hair tied back in a messy knot, completely devoid of her usual expensive blowouts. She looked up, her eyes locking onto my white suit. For a fraction of a second, the old arrogant Chloe flashed in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the crushing reality of her new life. She looked away, her shoulders slumping as she went back to wiping the counter. Preston was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years for wire fraud and SEC violations. He had left her with absolutely nothing but a mountain of legal debt and a ruined reputation. She was learning the value of a dollar the hard way. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B. The divorce and asset dissolution hearing was already in session. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table alongside my lead counsel. Across the aisle sat Marcus. He looked like a ghost of the arrogant investment banker I had married. He was wearing a shapeless, bright orange county jail jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled to a heavy chain wrapped around his waist. His silver hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and unkempt. His skin was pale and drawn, carrying the deep, hollowed-out exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 60 days locked in a concrete cell instead of a luxury suite. He could not even bring himself to look at me. The presiding judge, a formidable black woman with sharp, observant eyes and an absolutely no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses as Marcus's defense attorney stood up to speak. The lawyer looked incredibly nervous, clearing his throat multiple times before attempting his desperate final play. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, his voice lacking any real conviction. "While my client acknowledges the severity of his pending federal indictments, we are here today to discuss the dissolution of the marital estate. My client is currently indigent. His assets have been seized. We are requesting a modest temporary spousal support arrangement from the plaintiff." A collective murmur of disbelief rippled through the small gallery. Even my own lawyer let out a quiet scoff. "On what conceivable grounds, counselor?" the judge asked, her tone dangerously flat, leaning forward over her heavy wooden bench. The defense attorney wiped sweat from his forehead. He gripped the edges of his podium. "On the grounds of emotional and psychological contribution to the marriage." "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered. "For 5 years my client provided a stable, prestigious environment for the plaintiff. He introduced her to high society. He provided the social foundation that allowed her to quietly build her wealth. He served as the public face of their union, which allowed her to operate in the background. He is simply asking for a small monthly stipend to maintain basic living expenses during his criminal trial." I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of absolute calm, though a dark amusement flared in my chest. Marcus was actually trying to monetize his arrogance. I was trying to argue that treating me like a submissive accessory was a valuable service he had rendered. The judge stared at the defense attorney for a long, suffocating moment. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then she picked up a thick stack of papers from her desk. "Let me make sure I understand your argument, counselor," the judge said, her voice dripping with profound, freezing contempt. "Your client who embezzled millions of dollars from a bank owned by his wife is asking for alimony. Your client who secretly mortgaged his family estate to cover up his federal crimes is asking for financial sympathy. Your client who spent the entirety of his marriage hiding assets and funding a 22-year-old mistress with stolen money believes he provided emotional contribution." The defense attorney opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The judge dropped the stack of papers onto her desk with a loud final smack. "Request denied," the judge stated, the finality of her words echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Your client treated his marriage as a cover for systematic financial fraud. The evidence of his infidelity, his embezzlement, and his gross fiduciary negligence is overwhelming. He contributed absolutely nothing to this plaintiff's success, except a stunning display of hubris. The marital assets belong entirely to the plaintiff, shielded by the irrevocable trust she had the supreme foresight to establish. This divorce is granted, and your client leaves this marriage exactly as he entered this courtroom, with absolutely nothing." Marcus let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, dropping his heavy head onto the defense table. His shoulders shook violently beneath the bright orange fabric of his jumpsuit. He had spent his entire life believing the world owed him a fortune simply because of his last name. Now, a brilliant black woman sitting on a federal bench had legally stripped him of his final delusion. He was a convicted thief, and he was completely, utterly bankrupt. The judge struck her gavel, officially closing the chapter on my marriage to the Vance family. I stood up, thanking my legal team, and turned to walk down the center aisle. I did not look back at Marcus. He was a relic of a past I had already completely dismantled. I pushed open the courtroom doors and stepped out into the wide, sunlit corridor of the courthouse. I was finally free. I owned the bank. I owned the real estate. I owned my future. But my departure was abruptly halted. A frail, trembling figure stepped out from the shadows near the marble columns, physically blocking my path to the elevators. It was Beatrice. I almost did not recognize her. The commanding, terrifying matriarch of Atlanta high society was entirely gone. She looked as though she had aged 20 years in the span of 2 months. Her posture, once rigid with aristocratic pride, was severely hunched. She was wearing a faded, outdated trench coat that looked like it had been pulled from the back of a forgotten closet. Her hair was completely devoid of its usual salon perfection, hanging limply around her pale, deeply lined face. Beatrice had spent the last 60 days living in a cheap motel after I evicted her from the estate, without Marcus's stolen funds or Preston's fraudulent businesses to prop up her lifestyle. The reality of her total insolvency had crushed her. Her country club friends had abandoned her. Her society peers ignored her phone calls. She was completely isolated, a forgotten ghost haunting the edges of a world she used to rule. "Zuri," Beatrice croaked, her voice dry and raspy, devoid of its usual booming authority. "Please wait." I stopped my security detail, immediately stepping forward to flank me, but I raised a hand signaling them to hold. I looked down at the ruined woman. I felt no anger anymore. Her complete degradation was punishment enough. "What do you want, Beatrice?" I asked, my tone flat and purely transactional. Beatrice's lower lip trembled. Her eyes darted around the busy courthouse corridor, looking at the lawyers and clerks walking past. For decades, she had obsessed over public perception. She had treated me like dirt, because she thought acknowledging my humanity would lower her social standing. But hunger and homelessness have a way of eradicating pride. To my absolute shock, Beatrice's knees buckled. Right there in the middle of the crowded federal courthouse corridor, the former queen of Atlanta high society collapsed onto the dirty tile floor. She fell to her knees, bowing her head, completely submitting to the woman she had spent 5 years calling a low-born peasant. She reached out her shaking hands, grasping the hem of my pristine white trousers. "I am begging you," Beatrice sobbed, tears spilling down her wrinkled cheeks and dripping onto the floor. "I have nothing. The motel is kicking me out tomorrow. I cannot afford food. My friends will not speak to me. Marcus is going to prison. Preston is going to prison. I have absolutely no one. Please, Zuri, you have everything. You have the house. You have the money. Just give me a small allowance. Just enough to rent a small apartment. Just enough to eat. I will never bother you again. I will sign whatever you want. Please have some mercy on an old woman." She pressed her forehead against the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, a broken, desperate creature stripped of every single illusion she had ever harbored. I looked down at the top of her head. I thought about the dinners where she forced me to sit in silence. I thought about the garden parties where she introduced me as the hired help. I thought about the years of systematic racist cruelty she had inflicted upon me, simply because she believed she was untouchable. I slowly reached down and firmly removed her hands from my trousers. "Mercy is a privilege reserved for those who show it to others," I stated, my voice echoing with icy absolute finality. "You built your entire life on the belief that people like me were beneath you. You are simply experiencing the reality of the world you created. I suggest you learn how to fill out a job application, Beatrice." I stepped around her weeping, kneeling form and walked straight toward the elevators. I did not look back as the heavy metal doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor, leaving the remnants of the Vance family exactly where they belonged. But as the elevator descended, my secure mobile device vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a congratulatory message from Elias regarding the finalized divorce. Instead, the screen was flashing with a critical priority, one alert from my offshore cybersecurity division. The alert was not about Preston. It was not about Beatrice. It was an automated trigger from the dark web monitoring system I had set up to track Marcus's previous financial footprints. My blood ran cold as I read the encrypted text. Marcus was in federal custody, shackled and monitored. But moments before his final asset dissolution hearing began, a dormant dead man's switch he had planted years ago had just been activated. A secondary, highly encrypted program was currently executing a massive coordinated attack on the city's municipal power grid using Aura Capital's servers as the launch point. If the sequence completed, it would not just black out the city. It would perfectly frame my company for the greatest act of domestic cyberterrorism in state history. I did not panic. I simply tapped the notification authorizing the purge protocol Elias and I had built for this exact contingency. The flashing red screen instantly flipped to a calm, steady green. Threat neutralized. Marcus's dead man's switch was incinerated before it could bypass a single firewall. The system automatically forwarded the encrypted access logs directly to the FBI, adding a monumental domestic cyber terrorism charge to his rapidly expanding indictment. Before the elevator doors could fully close and take me to the ground floor, a pair of trembling, frail hands thrust between the metal panels, forcing them to slide back open. Beatrice practically crawled into the cab, refusing to accept my dismissal. She remained on her hands and knees, staring up at me with raw, animalistic desperation, physically blocking my exit. I looked down at the woman who had spent the better part of a decade trying to erase my humanity. This was the same woman who had deliberately arranged lavish family Thanksgiving dinners and forced me to eat in the kitchen at a small folding table alongside the hired staff, coldly claiming the formal dining room was reserved strictly for blood relatives of the Vance lineage. I did not curse at her. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of vindictive anger. True power never requires a raised voice. I reached into my clutch one final time and pulled out a crisp white business card. I held it out, letting it flutter down to the floor until it landed right in front of her tear-streaked face. "You can go here," I stated, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of emotion. "It is a transitional housing shelter for homeless women in the metropolitan area. It is entirely funded by Aura Capital's philanthropic division. They will provide you with a clean bed, a hot shower, and 3 meals a day. Welcome to the real world, Beatrice." Beatrice stared at the card. The name of the charity, printed in simple black ink, represented the absolute, irreversible annihilation of her lifelong obsession with class and privilege. The terrifying realization that she would now have to survive on the direct charity of the very woman she had spent years degrading finally broke whatever fragile pieces remained of her mind. Her shoulders caved in. She curled into a tight fetal position on the floor of the elevator, her desperate pleas dissolving into raw, guttural wails of total, catastrophic defeat. Her delusion of aristocratic superiority had been completely crushed. I stepped carefully over her shaking body, walking out into the sunlit lobby of the courthouse. I did not look back as the heavy metal doors slid shut behind me, sealing her inside and severing my ties to the Vance family forever. The bright, blinding sunlight of the courthouse atrium suddenly blurred. The harsh glare stretched and spun in a rapid, dizzying whip pan, swirling the colors of the past, until the light softened into the warm, ambient glow of my present reality. I took a deep, steadying breath, the bitter memories fading, as I settled back into the plush velvet sofa of my penthouse living room, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city I now owned. I reached across the polished glass of the coffee table and picked up a crystal goblet of dark, rich Cabernet. I leaned back into the deep velvet cushions, letting the heavy, pristine silence of the penthouse wash over me. The soft ambient lighting of the room cast a warm golden hue across my skin, perfectly reflecting the absolute peace I had finally secured. The dust had fully settled, and the landscape of my life was finally clear of parasites. Marcus is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, trading his bespoke tailored Italian suits for a scratchy orange jumpsuit. He spends his days staring at a cinderblock wall, counting down the agonizing hours of a mandatory federal sentence for cyberterrorism and wire fraud. Every ounce of his unearned arrogance has been methodically stripped away, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a man who defeated himself. Preston is right there in the system with him, his fraudulent corporate empire completely liquidated to pay off his mountains of legal restitution. He lost absolutely everything. The untouchable golden boys of high society are now just anonymous federal inmate numbers, and the women who enabled their cruelty have met an equally poetic fate. Chloe, who once paraded around in designer gowns funded by stolen money, now smells of stale espresso and industrial bleach, working double shifts at a corner cafe just to make rent. And Beatrice, the terrifying matriarch who truly believed she was a queen, is now just another face in a transitional housing shelter. She sleeps on a twin cot, eats from a plastic cafeteria tray, and survives entirely on the philanthropic grace of the very woman she used to force into the kitchen. They are both learning the brutal, unforgiving reality of manual labor. Many people think that women like us have to shout to be heard. Society expects us to react with loud, immediate anger when we are disrespected. They want us to scream to fight back in ways that allow them to comfortably label us as emotional or unstable. No, my silence was never submission. My quiet acceptance of their insults was not a sign of weakness or compliance. It was a calculated, deliberate strategy. It was the precious, uninterrupted time I used to map their vulnerabilities, audit their ledgers, and quietly lay the bricks of my empire right under their noses. I let their prejudice completely blind them while I bought the very ground beneath their feet. I swirled the dark wine in my glass, watching the city lights reflect in the crystal, and offered a soft, knowing smile to the room. The next time someone tells you to stay quiet because you are not in their league, just smile. Let them enjoy their fragile illusion of superiority, because they have absolutely no idea that they are standing on the very ground you own. Cheers. I raised my glass toward the glittering skyline, taking a slow, triumphant sip as the world around me faded into complete and absolute darkness.